Hi, everyone. This is episode 99 of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast, and you're going to hear 4 speeches given by 4 of the Notre Dame 10. The speeches are from back in 2019. This is a follow-up to episode 98. Sorry, it took me so long to get it up there. And then at the end, Father McCarthy gives a speech. So listen to those speeches. I just wanted to interject real quick before I include that video that I'm doing a 40 days of a rosary, nightly rosary at 9 o'clock p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And if you'd like to pray with me, this is for the 40 days of prayer and fasting that Father McCarthy has led every summer. And so I'm participating by doing a nightly rosary, and you're welcome to join me. So if you'd like to join me in a nightly prayer, you can come once, you can come every night. It doesn't matter. But if you'd like to join me, just click the link in the description for more information. And here's the great talks by some of the Notre Dame 10. All right, I'll see you next time.
Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Margie Feil, and I am a professor in the theology department and at the Center for Social Concerns here at Notre Dame. And it's my great honor to be able to introduce this panel tonight and moderate the discussion at the end. We gather tonight to remember the courage and witness of the ND10, and we do so in the context of our own time. What does their witness and conscience mean for us on campus 50 years later? I think of Indigenous students who led protests in recent years to demand the removal of the Columbus murals from the halls of the administration building. I think of students in Keenan and Stanford halls protesting acts of racial and gender violence, hate speech, perpetrated this past week, and calling for an end to parietals, holding a sit-in this past weekend. As reported in today's Observer, they too were threatened with expulsion for failing to disperse. I think of others who are meeting right now at this very moment with the South Bend City Council to prepare for a significant council meeting on November 25th addressing climate action. I also think of the aftermath of this weekend's game against Navy, kicked off by a now all too familiar flyover, this time of 4 Navy jets, 2 FA-18F Super Hornets and 2 EA-18G Growlers from the Naval Air Weapons Station in China Lake, California. FA-18s cost between $10,500 and $13,310 per hour, and that's just measuring fuel costs. But what is the true human, ecological, and social cost? What is the cost in terms of formation of conscience at this Catholic university and to this country and in our world? For fiscal year 2019, the Department of Defense Budget Authority is approximately more than $693 billion. The US spends more on defense than the next 7 countries combined. And according to Brown University's Costs of War project, the Department of Defense is the world's largest single consumer of oil. In 2017, the DoD's GHG emissions totaled more than 59 million metric tons. The military-industrial complex, of which Eisenhower warned in 1961, has colonized minds and hearts, and flyovers before every home game become a kind of addictive hit, conveying a message of the need for military force, at once stoking fear and glorifying violence with a false sense of security. As we listen and discuss the witness of the ND10 tonight, let us ask what conscience demands of us here and now. How is the Holy Spirit moving to form us and impel us to act in accord with conscience, both personally and communally? So I just invite you to settle in, and I think the speakers have their order, and you hopefully have a handout with brief biographies of the speakers. So I won't take the time to introduce them all individually. At the end of all 5 presentations, then we'll have some time for discussion. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming our panelists.
There's a Latin maxim from Cicero, Niscire autem quid antiquam natus sis accederit id est semper esse puerum. Not to know what happened before you were born is to be a child forever. We're talking tonight about things that happened before most of you were born, and our purpose is that you not be a child anymore, in spite of quite strong forces in our society that encourage just that. We'll be talking tonight about some people I was privileged to know when they were practically children, on this day a half-century ago, when they decided not to be, and suffered for it. We'll be talking about institutions, government, corporate, academic, and ecclesiastical, that caused great suffering by committing crimes and by being actively and passively complicit with the war crimes of others. The Notre Dame 10 and many others called our attention to those crimes 50 years ago, and they continue to do so because the crimes continue to be committed. As a Cicero of a century ago, a Virginian rather than a Roman, said, "The past is never dead. It's not even past." And unfortunately, the crimes of 50 years ago are not dead. They're not even past. Since the end of World War II, the United States government has killed between 20 and 30 million people in wars in Korea, Vietnam, the Mideast, and elsewhere. These wars were designed to maintain the worldwide economic hegemony the U.S. acquired as the only largely undamaged country after World War II. Russia had won World War II in Europe against Germany, but had been devastated by the process. They lost 27 million people in defeating Nazism. The U.S. lost 500,000 people in the Second World War as a whole. The U.S. had devastated Japan from the air, not just with the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the U.S. acquired their empire and what was left of that of our erstwhile ally, Britain, notably in the Middle East. American planners had foreseen and planned for that, even before World War II began. What American planners were thinking was set out clearly in a secret State Department document written by the liberal diplomat and historian George Kennan in 1948, three years after the end of the war. Quote, "We have," he means the United States, "we have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position and disparity. We need not deceive ourselves that we can afford today the luxury of altruism and world benefaction. We should cease to talk about vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of the living standards, and democratization. We're going to have to deal in straight power concepts. The less we are then hampered by idealistic slogans, the better." Close quote, close quote. That's what government circles were thinking in 1948 at the end of the war. The USSR, up to its collapse a generation ago, never controlled an economy even half the size of that of the US. In the years after World War II, when the US insisted that it had to defend Europe against Soviet attack by controlling European armies through NATO, the mechanized divisions of the Russian army were horse-drawn. But dominant social groups in the US wanted to control the world economy that had fallen into their laps. And the way to do it was the so-called Cold War, American war and war provocations designed to retard attempts to develop the economy of Eurasia, notably by Russia and China. The Cold War was in fact functional for both the US and the USSR because it gave them an excuse to control restless client states. When the US wanted to overthrow a recalcitrant government in Latin America, we said we were stopping communism. When the USSR invaded Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968, it was to, quote, "stop the reestablishment of capitalism." But we can see now from the distance of 2 more generations that the dominant partner by far in this malign conjunction was the United States. The U.S. was determined to retard economic development that was not coordinated with U.S. dominance of the world economy. That was the threat in South Vietnam when President Kennedy decided to invade it in 1962. The people of South Vietnam, where most of the war was fought, didn't have the good grace to accept the government that the U.S. government had picked out for them, as Latin American countries had been taught to do. They had the temerity to resist, and the Kennedy administration decided to make an example of them. We killed 4 million people to demonstrate the mafia principle that no one was allowed to run independent operations on our turf, which was the world. It was in fact hard to see the real situation then through the massive propaganda that the American government and media put forth through this 1960s, but the critical spirit grew throughout that decade. By 1969, when the Notre Dame 10 bravely and nonviolently took on the criminal complicity of the University of Notre Dame with that war, quote, about 70% of the public had come to regard the Vietnam War as fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake, largely as a result of the impact of student protest on general consciousness. But university officials at Notre Dame and elsewhere were on the side of the U.S. government, which continued to practice mass murder halfway around the world. There were 3 things that brought the Vietnam War to an end. 1, the bravery and sacrifice of the Vietnamese people's resistance to the U.S. invader. 2, the mutiny of the American conscript army in Vietnam, which led to the withdrawal of American troops and the hasty end of the draft. And 3, the opposition of the American people, like the Notre Dame 10. The protest movement began largely on campuses in very scattered ways. Each effort seemed completely alone and almost hopeless in the face of enormous antagonism, such as that shown by the Notre Dame administration. But students persevered, and the small efforts inspired others, and finally grew to a major mass movement, largely as a result of the impact of student protest on general consciousness. And that mass opposition compelled the business community and then the government to stop the escalation of the war. When the first Bush administration was able to arrange a Mideast war in 1991, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the resulting absence of the fake excuse for American war since World War II, stopping communism, President Bush, Sr., exclaimed that the real success of that war was that it showed, quote, the Vietnam syndrome is dead. By the Vietnam syndrome, Bush Sr. meant the revulsion of the U.S. populace against wars like Vietnam. U.S. planners had to overcome at least that revulsion if the ongoing foreign policy of the American elite was to continue to be enforced by war, regardless of the reluctance of the American people. And at the center of that foreign policy was the insistence of the American government that it control Mideast energy resources. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was actually going to be called Operation Iraqi Liberation until someone noticed that the acronym, OIL, gave away too much. When what the Pentagon called the Long War in the Middle East did not begin with the 9/11/2001 attacks, which the perpetrators of those crimes saw as counterattacks to U.S. depredations in the Mideast in the quest for the control of oil. During World War II, the U.S. State Department described the Mideast as the, quote, the most strategically important area of the world, and the area's vast energy resources, oil and natural gas, as, quote, a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. In the years since then, oil companies and their associates have reaped colossal profits, but even more importantly to the U.S., control over 2/3 of the world's estimated hydrocarbon reserves provides what every administration since World War II has seen as critical leverage over European and Asian rivals, what the State Department called veto power over them. The U.S. does not need Middle East oil for domestic consumption, and we in fact import very little oil from the Middle East. But we insist on controlling the region from Palestine to Pakistan, from the Caspian Seas to the Horn of Africa, and will kill a lot of people to ensure it, with Israel as our local cop on the beat, as the Nixon administration put it. And it should by now be clear that whether we call them Al-Qaeda, Taliban, insurgents, terrorists, or militants, the people whom we're trying to kill in the Middle East are those who want us out of their countries and off of their resources. In order to convince Americans to kill and die and suffer in this cause, the U.S. government and successive administrations has repeatedly lied about the situation, the biggest lie being the current one, that the U.S. is fighting a war on terror. My ghostly father, the late Dominican theologian Herbert McCabe of Oxford, wrote that the relevance of Christianity to human behavior is primarily a matter of politics, because it's concerned first of all with the forms of communication, the structures of relationship in which people live. We must continue the forms of communication in which the Notre Dame 10 participated so long ago.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Mahoney. In 1968, there was a neurobiologist named Charles Gross, and he had been studying monkeys and monkey brains. And in the monkey brain, he found, and I don't want to go exactly how they do this because I think the monkeys were live. In the monkey brain, they found cells in the brain that were dedicated to recognizing that they were looking at a face. A cell which would light up when it saw a face and then be inactive when it doesn't see a face. Even baby monkeys that were raised by people that didn't show their face later preferred looking at pictures of faces rather than looking at other objects. That natural selection had given the monkey the innate ability to immediately recognize a face. This was sort of revolutionary because the 20th century psychology to that point was sort of based on the idea that we start out as infants and we're blank to the world presents itself to us, and with intelligence, we figure out these things. But in fact, the point here is that the natural selection was giving social tools to that monkey to get a head start in figuring out the social world. And then it turns out that in the human brain, there are cell areas in the brain that are specifically devoted to social skills. And they're, for example, detecting eye contact. We think we learned that? No, that was a skill that was developed 25 million years ago, because even monkeys have that, and they broke off from the chain of evolution that far back. We have the ability to detect where somebody else is looking. We have the ability to detect that you and I are sharing our attention to some other object. These are social skills which give us, if you're into evolutionary biology or neuropsychology, it's this idea of theory of mind, the ability of us to detect how other people feel and think and have communication with other people, which is emotionally reciprocal. And it gives us the ability to sort of predict what other people do. And give us sort of an instinct for the social world. Daniel Kahneman, in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, called this kind of System 1 thinking, this intuitive ability to decode the social world. These tools that we got through natural selection were sufficiently strong that they allowed at least our species, Homo sapiens, to survive as against all other hominid kind of species. So we were able to prevail sort of clearly by, this is sort of like homicide, the species survive. But they got us that far. But the problem was that it still didn't solve the problem of having social skills to solve conflict and how to keep order in society. They didn't give us that far. Natural selection only went so far. So we looked then in the foundations of human culture, and every human culture had at its roots human sacrifice. And for a long time, sacrifice and the idea of picking out victims You could call it the unanimity of the lynch mob, or this kind of idea of ostracizing individuals from the group when they've done something to offend us, or when we are just pissed off about something's scaring us. The humans learned that they could feel better if they killed that person. They couldn't agree on some other things, who's going to have what mate, who's going to have what cave, who's going to have what territory, but they'd somehow come to unanimity on killing that person. And so this is what we learn in René Girard's The Scapegoat, where he discusses this process of mimetic violence and scapegoating as a founding and glue sort of to the human culture. And what Girard, I think for me, the main point of Girard's work, this is really a build-up to, for him, was the significance of revelation, the significance of Jesus coming onto the earth and teaching us a very particular single lesson. And the lesson being that the way to escape the scapegoating culture, where we have people who are essentially innocent victims, we throw the virgin off the cliff and the rains do come. So we have this thinking in society that kind of sacrifice helps us. It makes us feel better if we sacrifice somebody, and we are less worried about the plague or the enemy winning us or the drought coming. That the way to escape that kind of sacrificial violence, which is often, embraced by religions which embraced representations of sacrifice as part of their teachings, was simply to understand that the victim is an innocent victim, and that this is just a scapegoat, and this is just something that society is doing to try and impose order in society and sort of avoid blood feuds and reciprocal violence. And so to Girard, Jesus represents the example of the innocent victim, the victim that teaches us the lesson that this is a scapegoat, this is a mechanism, this is just symbolic, and this is not real, and that we have to learn other ways to deal with each other. And so this is what Christian love is all about. So I'm reminded of the concluding line from Gwendolyn Brooks' brilliant poem, "The Chicago Defender Sends a Man to Little Rock," ending with the phrase, "The loveliest lynchee was our Lord." Syncing together this idea of mass violence and Jesus' example as a way to address that. So in terms of evolution, natural selection only went so far. Scapegoating got culture coherent and got cultures to succeed, but yet they're fighting inside and using scapegoating to justify massive homicidal violence with other tribes, other people inside our group. And so for us, if we think about this and looking for how it is that our culture and how we, acting through our culture, create victims and cause this kind of violence, and in order to figure out how to escape that and replace love with what is now going for mass violence, is we have to look for the victims. We have to look and be very conscious of where victims are in the world and how they're created and how we, one way or another, and that's the question, one way or another, are responsible for the creation of those victims. For us, we were, back 50 years ago, we were consumed with the victims, and the victims created by the war in Vietnam, the American soldiers that were dying, the Vietnamese that were dying, soldiers, non-combatants, women, children, and babies. And you saw the poster up here of it had the pile of bodies, including babies, from the My Lai massacre. And the phrases and babies came from the congressional hearings where they asked a person who had participated in that, did they kill women and children? He said yes, and the question was, and babies? And the answer was, and babies. So we looked for victims, and these were a big motivation for us. Well, how can we let this be done in our name, in our culture? And we found the victims, and we see them now still all over the world. Additionally, we looked at what our country was doing in our name, in destabilizing countries around the world, trying to overthrow countries around the world. And so it was talked earlier about the CIA and its activities. Even today, of course, it's still going on. There's a new movie coming out called The Report about the CIA and its efforts to bury records about the torture of prisoners after 9/11. 6 years of reporting efforts to try and uncover that. This is the kind of research that we have to do to sort of figure out, it's hidden from us in our government, and we have a responsibility as citizens, starting out even as university students, to understand our complicity in these kinds of things. And that's what we were all about. There are documents in the university archives about complicity, about Notre Dame Inc., about what's the other, the one about recruitment. There's several that sort of investigate the university's role with different corporations and the kind of corporations that were coming to recruit students, and the university's involvement in those sorts of things. And this is what, I really think that our demonstration wasn't spur of the moment. It came out of a long, hard look at these organizations and some others as well. Honeywell later on in the spring of 1970 was also paired with Dow to come in and doing some interviewing, and a lot of students were all over this. And we didn't have the tools then. All the stuff that we had at the time about Dow and CIA came out of the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Washington Post, and other major newspapers, and looking at microfilm, all right? We didn't have the internet. You do have the internet today. You have the ability to go behind the wall and behind the curtain and see what are the entanglements that of the university in these activities. I thought it'd be interesting to tell you some of the, I think it's important to get a sense of the feelings at the time not by us, but by other students about what was going on and what was happening to us. The Scholastic had an editorial in January of 1970 that said, "We deplore the success of the bureaucracy in burying substantial questions beneath ill-formed legalism, and we deplore the callousness of Father Reilly in perverting recommendations of the Board of Appeals. Only the repeal of the suspension and the recognition of the moral issues can eliminate the injustice already done." The tripartite appellate board had recommended that all the penalties be reduced, which means, and that they all be the same, which means it had to be something less than suspension. But cynically, Father Reilly just said, well, okay, we'll make it all suspensions, and that's sort of what happened. This is a really might makes right mentality. It was, we're not going to listen to you. You have the right to rational persuasion, but we're not just not going to listen to you. And free speech, even in the legal circles, when you talk about free speech on the First Amendment, it's not just a right to speak. It's a right to speak and where people can hear you. It's a right to speak at places that other people find inconvenient or obstructive, and to be heard, not just to be able to speak somewhere off in the wilderness where nobody's going to hear you. But the administration of these universities, and Notre Dame especially, understand that students are only here for 4 years, and the administration is going to be here forever. And so they, number one, can use scare tactics to keep students silent, and then they, in our case, they also brought an injunction in state court to keep students away from the administration building, including our student body vice president and a number of others. So the administrations, they understand the ways to keep students quiet. I was fairly surprised. I mean, I don't know, this thing that happened in Stanford Hall on Sunday night. Anybody from Stanford here? All right, there we go. I mean, here are students, they belong in the university, they're trying to make a point. Obviously, it wouldn't be there if they didn't feel people were not listening to them about the kind of speech students might be using toward each other that was happening even that night, about issue of parietal hours. By the way, parietal hours has been a perennial issue. I was there when I was a student. Now it's a little bit more focused, but to even think of threatening students who are, you could say, misbehaving, but they're just making a point, to threaten them with expulsion from the university is just horrific. It shows no concern for, would somebody really do that? And some of them may really do that. That's the problem. And what effect it might have on their lives. You all as students have so much at stake here. You've worked so hard to get here. You're taking a position in the university that for every one of you, there's probably 100 that tried to get that position here at the university. So the idea of even to threaten that, whether it's a rector, or whether it's campus life or the campus police, this shows you how much worse it is now than it was when we were students. Can't they just listen? Willis Nutting was a famous teacher at the time. How am I doing on time? Am I way over what? Who cares, right? No. Anyway.
You have about 3 minutes.
Willis Nutting said, I can only explain such drastic measures as something born of hysteria. Our authorities must have thought they were dealing with burn baby burn people who could only be handled by force or threats of force. And then he talks about, I don't want to underestimate the difficulty of establishing a community at Notre Dame, because particularly those with authority, because they have to build the university. They have to, get money. They've got to get contributions. They've got to deal with corporations. They've got the board of directors, and they're rubbing elbows with all those people. And so they're the we. The corporations are the we that they deal with. The students are the they. The students are the ones who are disrupting things. And they're the Dow Chemical, CIA. They fit in perfectly well with the administration and their efforts to get money for for research programs, to build graduate schools and so on. And he said that they look at the students as irresponsible idealists, and of course as they get older they will get more sense, but until they get more sense they must not be allowed to upset the apple cart. They must be kept in line. Thus force and a fatal failure to allow Notre Dame to become a community, a fatal lack of an attempt to understand. But what Willis Nutting was saying, what Carl was saying, is that when it comes to the university, when it comes to our society as a whole, you have to sort of follow the money. Who has the interests? Who benefits from these kind of the end result of our foreign policies? And we see that it's so clearly in the world around us. John Hessler was a classmate of mine. He was our valedictorian, a brilliant man, and a terrific poet. And he gave a talk for his valedictory address that had a lot of things in it. And he called, later it was published in the Scholastic, and he said to speak of lies. Now I'll read a little bit of this to you because I think it gives a sense of how we felt at the time. He said, there's so little I can say that I can say truthfully. Words are treacherous things. All over the world, in every country, in every language, in every time, words have been the instruments of murder and violence and destruction. Words kill people. Even as I stand here under this flag, even as I am speaking, people are dying at the hands of one or another of a whole series of unspoken lies for which our flag has come to stand. The whole texture of lies we call our way of life has killed thousands of people, made life less than worthless to countless more. Now, I want to point out to you, at this time in his address, parents were walking out. Probably half of the parents, and probably a lot of students too, walked out on John, but he had the courage to keep going. But I want to point out, he talks about words can kill, and now we live in an environment where this very bizarre man tweets that we are abandoning the Kurds and sending our troops out of the area of Syria, and people die. Combatants for sure. Kurds were basically loyal to their own people, babies, women, children, babies, and they die because of words in a tweet. And babies, and babies. He said, I'm speaking to you of lies. In Washington, the play actors of our own ignorance and incompetence gather daily, pathetically intent on maintaining our glorious dream, our way of life. Few eyes remark the gathering darkness. Few voices admit to our nightmare perpetrations. He then, offered some words of hope and, but basically at the end said, when they ask us what we did to stop the murder of innocent human beings, when we think of our years at Notre Dame and of the very little we have the courage to do, then when we have come to live by our own set of lies, excuses, extenuations, then what will we say to them, talking about our children? I wonder, will we ask ourselves, why did we not stop this goddamn war? And this was a very emotional time for us at that kind of presentation. So one of the points I want to make is when we look at, the university has changed an enormous amount in the past 50 years. It's doubled, at least tripled, maybe tripled in geographic size and the size of its physical plant. Billions of dollars, certainly millions, I'm sure billions of dollars have been spent or pledged to the university to do this. And I wonder, had the university made a different decision back then in 1969? Had the university said, yes, you know what, we really need to listen. We really have to stop our participation in the military, in supplying soldiers and officers. We have to really stop this involvement with this military-industrial complex or corporations who are taking advantage of poor people around the world or stealing resources from other countries. We really have to do that. And if they had stuck to that, do you really think that the university would have been able to raise the money needed to create all these buildings and create this physical plant and expand the graduate schools and get the research money and have the donations and the corporate connections, which have allowed it to succeed in this so fabulously as far as they're concerned. And I suggest to you that the end here reflects a choice. It's still this massive raising of money reflects that was the goal. That's the goal, the institutional goal of the Notre Dame, to expand itself and increase its influence. But where in that is the regard for the Christian mission? And I think that's what we need to investigate. As sort of, as you know, Carl is saying, and Willis Nutting is saying, you've got to follow the money. And if we want to really understand what this university environment we live in is all about, you have to really go back and do the work and figure out where did this money come from and why and who gave it, under what kind of spirit. And would they have given that? Would that have been possible had it been the true spirit of Christianity that was guiding the administration in the choices it was making? So for students in our setting, we tried to do this with tools we had. We weren't all the most activist. There were others more active than us who were really the ones doing a lot of this work. And you do need to follow the money. You need to look for the victims, and you have to find out where the intersections are between the victims in the world and the money and the greed that is driving those people that are taking control of the world. I just have a couple of things I want to finish by pointing out. There's a very interesting article in the New Yorker on November 7th. It was an article by Max Norman about Emmett Gowan. Emmett Gowan was a great photographer, and he was really famous originally for very intimate photographs. And if we had time and so on, it'd be lovely to show them. But you can find it Emmett Gowan, Gowin, and start with the New Yorker article. Gowan, after having done a lot of intimate photographs of family where he grew up in Virginia, in 1996, after a long struggle of getting permission to do so, he was able to get permission to take photographs of the national security site in Nevada. It was a 1,300 sort of square mile area, which had been the area where the U.S. had done its atomic testing. Some of the atomic testing was done above ground, atmospheric testing, and of course there was quite a bit of fallout from that. People died from illnesses and cancer and so on. They did a lot of it underneath the ground. And Gowan, what he wanted to do, he took pictures of the remnants of those underground explosions. They sometimes had these bombs 1,000 feet into the ground, and then what happened is they had these patterns you could see now of craters in the ground, huge craters and huge patterns that make you think there's some puzzle here, there's some symbol here. And he's looking for the symbols to make sense of what we are doing to the earth and pounding it with these atomic weapons, which had an objective, which of course is nothing but massive homicidal violence. And so Norman says in this, a sense of mystery and wonder hovers over these images, and it's hard to check the urge to look for symbols. The photographs of the desert invite and challenge us to look at the beleaguered earth in the way we would look at a portrait, to see this wasteland as the object of care. Then he says, with more than 6,000 nuclear weapons in the American stockpile, we're still in the atomic age. But the anxiety that haunts us now is of the slow, creeping climate crisis, an instant catastrophe, but not an instant catastrophe, but an Iliadic siege. The ethical problems of that crisis, beyond mere political organizations, remain the same as the ones that animate the Nevada test site. How do we focalize our little lives in relation to the world? And how do we regard that world, however disfigured, with the same care and attention that we would give to another person? And I see, such a connection between the things we were concerned about then and the things that are now we call these existential crises about climate change and so on. There's a book in 2012 by Christian Parenti. So I've written a lot of very interesting works, expose kind of works, and he really started talking about world violence and warfare and instability in light of climate change, and talked about climate wars having begun in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and this gathering, this new catastrophe, this belt of economically and politically battered post-colonial states and who are threatening to become failed states where there's also the biggest climactic disasters. And I wonder, he talks about this incipient climate fascism. If we've responded, see how we've responded to the struggles and acquisition of resources, control of land, control of strategic areas around the world with use of military force. What's going to happen when it becomes layered on top of that, the struggles of climate, where people are losing arable land, where they have no longer fresh water, where we're, for God's sake, using fresh water from aquifers to use in fracking to create waste that nobody can treat. I mean, this insanity that's happening with the environment in the world, but it's happening with, especially with climate change and in areas of the world. How are we going to respond militarily? We respond to this, and I suggest it's got to be militarily. We send people off to the military with these ideals that we're going to live up to American ideals of democracy and freedom and liberty and all that stuff. But when you look back at the record of what that's been about in the past 50 years, it's been about, well, we know what it's about. When Trump does his tweet to unleash the Turks, to slaughter the Kurds. Their main thing is where we take the troops to protect the oil. It's oil in Syria, but somehow he calls it our oil. This is symbolic of the use of U.S. military force. And when it comes to climate, and we have all these resources. We got the Great Lakes, all this fresh water. We got all these technical skills and so on. Are we going to share that with the world? Are we going to continue? Are you going to try to make an equitable distribution of the world's resources? As Carl points out, certainly we don't have that at the present time. And what's the role of the military going to be in enforcing the current relationship the United States has and people in the country, which we don't want to give up in terms of its control of resources and its preference in the world. So these are all these things that are so much that we need to look at. And I suggest it ought to be looked at in our institutions. Look at the university, its investments, and what's its research and its board entanglements. If I can have just another minute, I want to read you something. This is something we had the benefit of some wonderful thinkers, some wonderful writers at the time. And the last time I spoke, I mentioned this too, and I wanted to just say this about what the significance I feel of the Notre Dame 10 was in our experience and what maybe others can take away from it. And one of the great writers among us at the time was Rich Moran, who wrote for the Scholastic, and he wrote this in the spring of 1970. I'm reminded of a passage from Trotsky, once related by one of my teachers. Trotsky describes history as a troop train moving through the countryside. The train is packed with soldiers. One particular soldier stands at a small window of the train and gazes at the miles of barren wasteland. Finally, the train passes through a town, and the soldier sees a girl standing not far from the track. He winks at the girl, and she winks in response, but then she's gone. For Trotsky, the train represents the irresistible force and direction of the mass movement of history. The soldier is a meaningless integer. His love and his passion mean nothing amidst the ruthless force of history. But if we look at this metaphor not from the perspective of the train, but from the inside of the soldier's soul, we see that the wink means everything. And if we imagine the train as our deteriorating yet relentlessly brutal society, and the Christian university as the soldier on that train, and perhaps even Christ as the girl on the side of the road, we can understand the importance of the wink, the importance of a generous and gratuitous gift of understanding and love. If we are to fulfill the possibility of this wink, we must first be courageous enough to unfix our eyes from the course of the train, to put aside our blind, uncritical love of our country, its history, and its power. And if we choose to wink, within that wink we must reside a willful acceptance of the responsibilities of love. For while the soul of a university demands that we look outside the train, the flesh and bones that distinguish a Christian university demand first that our gaze be permeated with passion, a passion seeking eternal happiness, and second, that it be generously committed to its vision. For if we continue to make claims to a Christianity and continue to ignore the demands that these claims make upon us, we are no better than the soldier who stares hard-faced and unblinking at the girl whose tenderness lays siege to his soul. So the issue for us, I feel, is one of faith, having the belief in what the gospel teaches and the courage to act. It also is that most elusive of virtues, which is hope. The hope that our collective dedication to those beliefs, to that wink, will gradually bend the tracks on which the train rides, tilting its arc, the arc of destiny toward the God of love.
Good evening. I'm Chris Cotter. I spent my first year in 105 Stanford. The title of my talk is The Explosive Power of the New Testament. When I arrived at Notre Dame in 1966, I was interested in two things: football and finding a career that would allow me to earn enough money to belong to a country club, to play golf, and associate with the right people. I left Notre Dame with a different worldview and without a degree. That change in worldview was due in part to what Charlie McCarthy once said: if you say you're a Christian, you must read the New Testament. While not a very good Christian then, and still not to this day, I took the message to heart. I purchased a Jerusalem Bible New Testament, and I began to read. What I read confirmed what I had heard in the Christian ethics class taught by Father Maury Amon, as well as the courses in gospel nonviolence taught by Charlie and Jim Douglas. As the consequences of CIA unfolded, I had conversations with various people in authority at Notre Dame. Father Jim Reilly was the dean of students who invoked Father Hesburgh's infamous 15-minute rule that ultimately led to our suspensions from the university. In one conversation, we talked about the teachings of Jesus. I mentioned some of the more difficult ones found in the Sermon on the Mount, his teachings against violence, as well as his sacrificial death on the cross. I stated that Jesus set the example of how we were to live. Father Reilly's response was, Jesus was God, Chris. He could do those things, but we can't. I was surprised that a Catholic priest would say something like that. I also had a conversation with the chairman of the University Board of Trustees, and in my youthful arrogance, I challenged, well, have you ever read the New Testament? He responded, no, but I think I know it well enough to argue it with you. So, Jesus was God, so he can't be expected to live the way he lived, or I think I know it well enough to argue it with you. These are just two examples of what I was hearing from those in authority at Notre Dame. Later, I had another conversation with a prominent Notre Dame person, a member of the theology faculty, Father John L. McKenzie. Father McKenzie was the foremost biblical scholar of his day, respected by both Catholics and Protestants. He had an entirely different take on the New Testament. This quote is from the Introduction to the Power and the Wisdom, his insightful book on the New Testament. Listen to the difference between this and what I was hearing from those in authority at Notre Dame. Quote, most Catholics think they are somewhat familiar with the New Testament. In the composition of this book, I experienced a growing conviction that the thing with which we believe we are familiar, I know it well enough to argue with you, is not the New Testament. It is a conventionalized, popular understanding of the New Testament. The simplicity of the New Testament can be deceptive. We have lived with it so long that its explosive power has become sweet reasonableness. More than the Old Testament, it has been rationalized into harmony with a way of life which is often a compromise between the world and the gospel, end quote. A way of life which is a compromise between the world and the gospel. In Romans chapter 12, verse 2, St. Paul says, do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, so that you may judge what is God's will, what is good, pleasing, and perfect. So there's a great difference between the values of this age, the values of our current culture, and the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. When we hear the gospel proclaimed on Sundays, we don't experience its explosive power because we've been so conditioned by our culture to conform to the values of this age. The gospel then becomes the sweet reasonableness that Father McKenzie identified. I once heard a talk by a Catholic priest who was asked in the Q&A what he thought was the unspoken, unidentified national sin of America. Without hesitation, he replied, greed. Yes, greed. Even a cursory reading of the New Testament shows that acquisitive, opulent lifestyles, massive retirement accounts, and even expensive country club memberships are contrary to the gospel message of simple living, caring for the poor, and practicing the works of mercy, what Father Thomas Dubay calls a sparing, sharing lifestyle. I would argue that another unspoken, unidentified national sin is violence and militarism. We don't see it because we have been steeped in it almost from the moment of birth. Cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, James Bond's License to Kill, war heroes, superheroes, NCIS, the Terminator, and on and on. We don't see it because we've been so conditioned by the propaganda of the military, industrial, congressional, educational, media, and even ecclesial complex to conform ourselves to their values, the values of this age. We don't see it because it's all around us, almost in the air we breathe, and certainly in the universities we attend. How could a university that calls itself Christian, in contrast to the clear teaching of Jesus Christ, permit and even encourage its young men and women to be trained to participate in our nation's unjust, immoral, and imperialistic wars that have resulted in the deaths of countless innocent civilians? How could a university that calls itself Catholic, in contrast to the clear teaching of the Catholic Church, award honorary degrees to individuals who believe that killing children before they are born is not only not evil, but actually virtuous? The answer is simple. We have conformed ourselves to the values of this age rather than the Word of God. To find solutions, we have to be willing to renew our minds, as St. Paul teaches. How might we do that? Well, St. John of the Cross has an answer. In describing how the Christian might enter the active night of sense and begin the arduous journey toward union with God, he says, first, have habitual desire to imitate Christ in all your deeds by bringing your life into conformity with his. You must then study his life in order to know how to imitate him and behave in all events as he would. In his document on sacred scripture, the Second Vatican Council quotes St. Jerome, ignorance of the scriptures is ignorance of Christ. It also points out that reading alone is not sufficient. Prayer should accompany the reading of sacred scripture, it says, so that God and human beings may talk together. For we speak to him when we pray, we hear him when we read the divine saying. So the direction is clear. In order to renew our minds, we must read, study, and pray the sacred scriptures. What might we see if we opened the Bible and began to read the Gospels with, as St. John of the Cross advises, a desire to imitate Christ? The first of the great commandments is to love God with our entire being, heart, mind, soul, and strength. How do we do that? Do we measure love for God by the intensity of our emotional response to prayer, or by the joy we feel when we sing our favorite hymns, or by the sense of elation we may experience after a particularly good liturgy? No. Jesus has another way to measure love for him, and it can be found in one simple, yet for some terrifying word: obedience. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. The Sermon on the Mount, found in chapters 5, 6, and 7 of Matthew's Gospel, has been called a blueprint for living. Of its 111 verses, there are about 48 imperative statements and numerous implied commands. In order to see how serious Jesus is about obedience, we need to look first at the end of the sermon found in chapter 7. First, he tells us to enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and those who find it, those who enter through it, are many. How narrow the gate and constricted the road that leads to life, and those who find it are few. He also speaks about the day of judgment. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? Did we not drive out demons in your name? Did we not do mighty deeds in your name? Then I will declare to them solemnly, I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers. In other words, religious people doing impressive works, even in the name of Jesus, are not necessarily doing the will of the Father. Jesus then concludes the sermon by comparing wise builders whose houses survived storms because they were constructed on foundations of rock to foolish builders whose houses do not survive because they were constructed on foundations of sand. The difference between the two is their response to the words of Jesus. The foolish heard his words but did not act on them, while the wise heard his words and acted on them. Here are just a few examples of Jesus' commands found in the Sermon on the Mount, just a few. Do not store up treasures for yourself on earth. Rather, store up treasure for yourselves in heaven. Give to anyone who begs from you, and do not turn your back on the borrower. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, offer no resistance to someone who is wicked. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and offer the other cheek as well. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Strive to be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. He is talking here about the perfection of love, which, in imitation of Jesus, must extend even to our enemies. Jesus was perfectly consistent. He practiced what he preached what he's practiced. There is no doubt that he was poor, that he practiced nonviolent love of both his friends and his enemies, and that he modeled perfect obedience, obediently even accepting death on a cross. The words of Jesus are simple to understand, but our fallen human nature rebels against them. To quote Father Mackenzie again, the simple see at once that the way of Jesus is very hard to do, but easy to understand. It takes real cleverness and sophisticated intelligence to find ways to evade and distort the clear meaning of what Jesus said. Father Felix Padamatam explains this desire to distort the clear meaning of what Jesus taught. He says, at the heart of this, and presumably all opposition to accepting Jesus, is the display of the basic ailment affecting our race, conscious or unconscious rebellion against the full reign of God. There were, however, some 20th century Christians who did not rebel and who did desire to imitate Jesus and bring their lives into conformity with his. To name just a few, the servant of God Dorothy Day and St. Teresa of Calcutta understood that in serving the poor, they were actually serving Jesus. They also understood that Jesus rejected all forms of violence. Blessed Franz Jägerstätter was an Austrian peasant who was beheaded for his refusal to participate in Hitler's wars. St. Maximilian Kolbe, the great missionary and promoter of Marian spirituality, was declared a martyr to charity because he offered his life in exchange for a fellow prisoner at Auschwitz. And St. Oscar Romero, Archbishop of El Salvador, was martyred while celebrating Mass because he spoke the truth of the gospel to those who were persecuting his people. I could elaborate on each of these holy people. Instead, let me tell you about some little-known heroes of the Christian faith. This occurred in Korea in the 1950s. When the communists took over the country, they began persecuting Christians. They arrested a Christian pastor, his wife, and their small children. They placed them in a deep hole and demanded that they renounce Christ or be buried alive. The children were hysterical. Looking at his children, the father opened his mouth as if to speak the words that would save their lives. His wife quickly intervened. She said, "Hush, children. Tonight, we are going to have supper with the King of Kings." She then led them in singing in the sweet by and by. Those who witnessed their martyrdom said that you could still hear them singing as the earth covered them over. Jesus says, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. In hearing the words of Jesus and acting on them, this Christian family literally sowed the seeds of their lives into the ground and bore a great harvest, because everyone who witnessed their martyrdom was converted to Christ. Each of the individuals I mentioned understood and lived the explosive power of the New Testament. To a small or great degree, they improved the world around them and gained eternal life, but they did so at great personal cost, even to the point of martyrdom. What would happen if a handful of Christians like us really took the words of Jesus literally and began to act on them? We would see an explosion of power that could change the world, and maybe even Notre Dame. Do we have the desire and the courage just to begin? In conclusion, I return to the words of St. John of the Cross. If we desire to experience the explosive power of the gospel, we must first have habitual desire to imitate Christ in all our deeds by bringing our lives into conformity with his. We must then study his life in order to know how to imitate him and behave in all events as he would. That was St. John of the Cross, writing in the 16th century. But it sounds a lot like what Charlie McCarthy told me 50 years ago. If you say you're a Christian, you must read the New Testament. Notre Dame, our mother, pray for us.
Good evening. How's everybody? I'm John Eckenrode, and I wanted to thank you for coming. It's really good to be back on campus. I did want to take a moment before the rest of my remarks to thank everyone who's both come here and who's supported us on this day of remembrance and reflection. I want to thank, is David still here? Courtwright still here? No, he had to leave early. I want to thank David, who from the Kroc Institute, who's a co-sponsor of this event, and I want to thank them for their support. If you don't know David's history, it's worth looking up. David was very active during the Vietnam War as inside the military and helping mobilize his Army colleagues against the war, and paid some prices himself. And I think it's a story worth telling. And if you don't know about it, I'd encourage you to find out about that. I want to thank a number. I can't thank everybody by name because there's just been a number of people that have come forward to help us put this day together and to interact with us. We certainly had a number of students, including student journalists and writers for The Observer, for The Scholastic. We have Margaret Fosmo here from the Notre Dame magazine covering us all day, so thanks for taking a day. We have a university photographer here somewhere who's been following us around all day, and so we really appreciate the time that people have taken. I want to give special thanks to Mark Delamano. Where's Mark? Is he in? There he is, who's been a fellow traveler all these years for these various events we've had over the years, and same with John Cox, who's here, who's been, again, just a great supporter of our efforts to come back to campus and tell our story and to engage with students. And we want to thank you. Thank you, Margie, for agreeing to moderate and to helping us out as well. So there's a lot of people to thank. I'm sorry, I can't name everybody. I don't have time, but thank you for coming. My involvement in the LCIA protests is really a lesson in how an ordinary student can take an action that moves them from a bystander status to taking a more active role in moral and ethical issues of the day. I really was an ordinary student, not one of the leaders or organizers of the protest. I was a pre-med major at the time, and actually that day, November 18th, I was on my way to the library to study for an organic chemistry test that evening. Organic chemistry, it was a weed-out course at the time. It probably still is a weed-out course for pre-med majors. So I had some anxiety about that for the evening. I had been a student in Emil Hoffman's inorganic chemistry class. You might have heard about Emil Hoffman, who's deceased now, but I think I got a C in that class. So I was struggling a little bit as a pre-med major, and so I was a little anxious about what this organic chemistry test was going to be that evening. I did end up taking the test that evening. I think I got a B-. But I knew about I'd been keeping in touch with the events leading up to the protest, and had attended some of the events in the previous year in 1968. Our event was actually the third protest against Dow's CIA recruitment on campus. There had been a fairly major event the year before. About 100 students did a 3-day visual at the administration building, protesting the Dow and CIA recruitment on the same day under the Golden Dome. There was no blockage of doorways and so forth, but it was a pretty major event. So I've been keeping in touch with those issues. I've been troubled by the war and the stark contrast between my Catholic upbringing from kindergarten onward and the words of the gospel and what was going on in Vietnam. I was becoming increasingly aware of how Notre Dame was connected to those issues institutionally, for better and for worse. And I was personally to the point where I was ready to move beyond being on the sidelines of the anti-war movement. Thomas Merton spoke of the idea of, I think it's, Charlie can correct me, or Carl, kairos, is that the Greek word, which really means the time of urgent and providential decision, the time to make a commitment, whether it's popular or unpopular, before the opportunity passes. I certainly felt that this was an opportune time and a necessary time for action. But when I decided to take some time from studying and go to the administration building, I wasn't really thinking ahead of time of blocking doorways. And while I grew convinced that it was a defensible action given the enormous symbolic meaning of the presence of Dow and CIA under the statue of Mary, I of course had no idea of how things were going to unfold following the invocation of the 15-minute rule and the weeks and events that followed, culminating in our appeals hearing. Now, this event, during the demonstration, there was at least 100 people there. Some people decided to sit down on the floor and not block doorways. A group of other people decided they wanted to go the next step and block the doorways. So there were supporters of us who were in the doorways, and then there was a group in the doorways itself. So it was quite a large gathering. Personally, this event, following the end of it and the collection of the ID cards by Father Rioli, and then, as Mark said, we getting a letter in our dorm room that evening saying that the 15-minute rule had been invoked and we were all either suspended or expelled. This was obviously a personally difficult situation to bring back to my parents. You can imagine the phone call home after getting that letter. It was particularly poignant for me. My father was a Notre Dame graduate. He was in the Naval V-12 program in 1942 when Notre Dame was essentially a naval academy, if you go back and look at the pictures. He then was stationed in the Pacific on a sub-chaser as a lieutenant coming out of Notre Dame. My mother was a South Bend native, and I had several aunts, uncles, and cousins living here at the time. Actually, I have a lot of cousins living here now. My uncle, Edward Vorty, was mayor of South Bend, Pete Buttigieg predecessor, starting in 1958. So I had a lot of family connections to South Bend and Notre Dame. So you can imagine the surprise when I called home that evening and told my parents that I had been suspended. Luckily, they supported me and allowed me to come back and be a student, re-enroll as a student. This event was also an incredible part of my education at Notre Dame. I really met wonderful people like Charlie and Carl, worked with a great group of students like Mark and Chris, and I'm sure that students here feel as though there's some of the work they do outside the classroom has great value, whether they do it locally in the local community or internationally, and working to alleviate poverty or work for peace. And I'm sure you feel like that has great meaning for you as well outside of your coursework. But if there's a lesson in my example, it's that there are many ways to respond to violence and injustice. You don't always have to be the leader or the person on the front pages. You can take small steps that make a big difference. After graduating in January of '72, a semester late, I went to graduate school, and now I'm a retired professor of human development at Cornell. when I was not retired, I was directed a center that does work to address issues of violence in families, such as issues around child abuse and neglect, for example, and partner violence, as well as promoting healthy development among at-risk youth. That's how my own life course and professional life connects to the issues of violence in our society. And although still concerned with issues of war and peace on a larger national and international arena, I did not become a prominent anti-war activist after I graduated. Again, there's many ways to integrate our values and commitment to nonviolence in our personal and professional lives. Mine happened to be around research and teaching aimed at preventing violence to children and adolescents. It's with this concern in mind that I approached the so-called endless wars that Carl talked about in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and so forth, as well as the so-called proxy wars in Yemen and elsewhere with dismay. I really worry about this generation of children growing up in these environments, and for the many innocent children that have been lost, and for those who have survived, what it means for their development when they have been exposed to so much loss and violence. Now, we've all seen the iconic picture of the girl in the photo. If you were here earlier, it was up on the screen. Who was horribly burned by napalm, the '72 photo. It helped galvanize a nation against war. It was probably the most famous photo out of the Vietnam War. For that girl, however, you may not know that she survived. You would think maybe she passed away from her injuries. She was burned over a large part of her body. That girl survived. She not only survived, she grew up into a woman, and she got married and had 2 children, and she runs a foundation devoted to addressing problems of children in war. In psychological parlance, we might call her resilient. She describes her Christian faith as one factor that helped her overcome her terrible childhood and the years of medical procedures that followed. But it was also her extended family, network of family and friends, and a loving husband. Children can recover from the horrors of war, but it's not automatic, nor is it easy. We do have a duty to the children we have harmed. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just in the service of time. I am a little dismayed. I'll just mention a couple international protocols that we have decided not to be treaty of. One is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Actually, in a couple days, the 20th of November, will be the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the guiding principles of the Convention include non-discrimination, adherence to the best interest of the child, the right to life, survival and development, and the right to participate. Currently, 196 countries are party to it, including every member of the United Nations, except the United States. Likewise, in 2004, 104 countries had signed the protocol on the prohibition or restrictions on the use of incendiary weapons that bans the use of weapons such as napalm and white phosphorus on civilian populations or military targets close to civilian populations. As of April 2018, it had been adopted by 115 state parties. The U.S. is not a party to the protocol and, of course, used white phosphorus in the Middle East. So there will continue to be children growing up like that girl in the photo back in 1972, but now in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan, who will have to endure the experiences she endured in a previous generation. So 50 years later, at Notre Dame and elsewhere, can we ask what has changed? You all can help us answer that question or pose that question as it applies to Notre Dame. I'm encouraged by some developments in recent years, such as the establishment of the Kroc Institute or the hiring of faculty like Margie who teach about nonviolence and peaceful resolution to conflict. But I also continue to see a vigorous ROTC program on campus and other signs that the ties to the military-industrial complex are alive and well. So this is a continuing conversation and one that I hope we can engage in tonight and into the future. And I thank you all for coming.
Well, I'm Charlie McCarthy, and when I was here in 1969 on November 18th, 50 years ago today, I was not one of the ones that was arrested or thrown out of school or anything like that. But I was with the fellows before and after, and with them today. And I was with them because I believed that what they were doing was right. And that it's hard to get back to the atmosphere of the time, okay? If any of you here are freshmen, say, I was a freshman here 61 years ago. I came on the campus, 1958. And if someone started talking to me about something that happened 50 years before I came to this campus, 1908, I have no idea. You know, they could give me the statistics and the other thing, but there was a living reality in 1908 that just impossible to reach back into. Well, now I'd say the same thing for basically anyone who's under 50 here. Because 50 years ago when this happened, there was a reality in the country. There was a reality in the world. There was a reality here on Notre Dame campus and a lot of other campuses that is quite inexpressible. In 1966, now I was in Paris, and on the front page of Le Monde or whatever it was, headlines that Bertrand Russell, Jean-Paul Sartre had just conducted a war crimes trial and convicted Lyndon Johnson of war crimes. And I thought to this 66 now, this is not too long before, and I thought to myself, well, yeah, the war is off wrong, but war criminals? There was a great embargo on the news in terms of what was happening in Vietnam until gradually reporters came back and began to send the pictures. And we began to see and hear things that normally you don't see and hear during war. So, by the time 1969 rolls around, just to be clear, there was no doubt about what the American military, the American politicians, and the CIA and Dow Chemical were doing. It was absolutely, you didn't have to be a reader of Mother Jones magazine or Ramparts or Z or something like that. It was there for everyone to know and see. And the majority of American people didn't want it. And so there's an atmosphere that can't be communicated here. And I think, and I want to address that, because I was 10 years older than most of these fellows here at the time. And it's not that 10 years is that great a distance now, but 10 years back, when you know how it is, when you're 10 and then you're 20, there's a whole bunch, been 20, 30, it gets less and less till you get to where we are now, and you don't know what month it is, you know, and it's all that sort of business. But, you know, I saw it a little bit differently. What everyone said here tonight, I would agree with. Everything everyone said here tonight was the consciousness of the time for them. But I saw it a little bit differently, then and now. People say to me, my own classmates, I graduated in 62, and a lot of other Notre Dame people and priests over the last 50 years that I've been talking about this event. Charlie, if you don't like Notre Dame, leave it. Love it or leave it. Well, why do you keep bothering with this stuff for? It's history. And of course, love it or leave it is just it's just a trashy way of trying to get over a moment. I graduated from here. I got 3 degrees from here. My wife graduated from here. I have 8 children that graduated from here. I'm a Catholic priest, but I'm a Byzantine priest, so I'm married. I taught here. It's not a question of love it or leave it. When we were here last year, we celebrated Mass with Ted Hesburgh. The 10 of us, all of us, came together, and we celebrated Mass with Ted Hesburgh, and our differences were clear. It's still clear, even there at the Mass and afterwards, but there was no hostility, there was no anger, there was no wanting to hurt or that sort of business going on, as there was not on November 18, 1969. It wasn't that kind of atmosphere. But what it was a very clear sense that something had gone terribly wrong at Notre Dame. Terribly wrong. And that somehow, this something that had gone terribly wrong at Notre Dame had to do, in large part, with the Holy Cross priest. I told Ted Hesburgh at the Mass last year, in fact, my homily at the Mass, I said to him, he was responsible for the first major step in my life towards nonviolence. He didn't know he was when I was an undergraduate here, because of something he did and said as just trying to be a good priest. And out there at Notre Dame in the Holy Cross Order, there have been through Notre Dame hundreds, if not thousands, of good priests who day in and day out have worked hard to bring the gospel and to help young people grow in their Christian Catholic faith as there are today. And nothing can take away from that. But if something is wrong, it's wrong. And it's not validated as good because there are good things happening. It doesn't work that way. Our intent in '69, and the various times we've come here since, was not to diatribe and so forth regarding the evils of Notre Dame. Notre Dame does many good things, many wonderful things for many, many people, not just here, not just students, but all over the world. Our intent was to bring a blessing to the university. Today, 10 years ago, to bring something good. That's the intent. But my sense of the thing was in '69, and still is today, and over all these years, when people are saying forget it and I'll love it or leave it or that sort of business there, who are Notre Dame graduates, something went seriously wrong at Notre Dame in that moment. And therefore, I treat this event, both in '69 and here in the event, as both very solemn and very serious. On November 18, 1969, there was a clear, palpable clash between the holy and the wicked. Wicked. There was a choice that had to be made. John mentioned Carl's, as you know, that there was a fork in the road. Clear, very, very clear. There was this group of people, which once again, you've got to know the history of Tao at that time. You might see a little of it here in a minute. There was this group of people, human beings, making chemicals and making a fortune off of creating the most diabolical form of bringing suffering and death to people. Unrelievable suffering and death. There was an organization, the CIA, which at that time was well known worldwide as tearing the people of Vietnam apart at least since the early 1950s. Graham Greene wrote a novel, The Quiet American, 1954, in which he lays out what the American CIA is doing in Vietnam, killing and undermining and causing riots and so forth and so on. 1954. As we mentioned today about Graham Greene, it's why he never got the Nobel Peace Prize. The point is that something had come, a wave, if you will, had come. It was palpably clear that in 1969, on November 18th, what the CIA was and was doing, and what Dow was and was doing, and both of them pointed to a war that Thomas Merton referred to in '66 as an overwhelming atrocity. That Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who was probably the most famous Catholic in America at that time, publicly and vociferously condemned in a public letter to Lyndon Johnson before the Berrigans condemned it. He called it, he said to Johnson, you were to get out of there because this is an immoral activity, it's murder, and you are not to stay behind to fix the thing. It was known what was going on in Vietnam. And yet, year after year after year, Notre Dame was turning out ROTC people to go over there and murder people. And it was murder, because remember, in Catholic theology, an unjust killing of a human being is murder. So what I'm raising here is my sense of the thing, my living of the thing, these 50 years and back then, was not fundamentally political. It was spiritual and moral, in terms of Catholic spirituality and morality. In no way, shape, or form, under any sets of circumstances, did the Vietnam War ever come within light years of either meeting the teaching of Jesus or what was traditionally called Catholic just war theory. It was an activity of mass murder. And so, on November 18th, 1965, the 10 students and some others and so forth try to raise the issue by the Dow CIA people coming and all the stuff that you've heard tonight and other things you read in the paper. But the point was at that point that compared to what they were protesting, the university brings suffering down on them, makes them and their families to suffer, kicks them out, causes great turmoil in their minds and the families' minds and so forth and so on, and embraces as a Catholic university the diabolical activity that the CIA and Dow represented in the Vietnam War. Embraces it. It reminded me, when they came down on the students, and I said this to some people today, it reminded me of when the Berrigan brothers and the Catonsville Nine, Tom Lewis and so forth, when they burnt napalm the draft files outside of the draft board in Catonsville in 1968, May 11. It reminded me of the little handout that they gave that day as they waited for the police to come. Handed out to the police, who are agents of the government, saying, "How dare you arrest us for napalming paper when you are napalming children?" Dan Berrigan came back from Vietnam, and his line was famous during the Vietnam War. Vietnam became the land of the burning children. That's what we're talking about in '69, the land of the burning children. So, on November 18th, 1969, however it was articulated in people's minds, there was an awareness in my mind that something unspeakably evil was going on, and the university was embracing it. There is no more insidious form of evil, no more treacherous form of evil than when evil masquerades itself as the holy. When Notre Dame, that is a university that would not exist but for the life, suffering, and death of Jesus Christ, and exists to carry on his mission, or it has no raison d'etre. If Notre Dame embraces someone with its massive public relations department and efforts, it embraces someone, that gives the embrace of God to it. Or at least it says it's not so bad, when in fact it is disastrous. Absolutely disastrous. Now, I think it's at this point here, I just want to take a moment and show a little video, just a little video, short one, very short one, that has been barred from YouTube because it is contrary to community standards.
Only a tramp was Lazarus who there like a tramp on the street. He was Mary's own darling. He was God's chosen son. Once he was fair, once he was young. Mary, she rocked him, her little darling, to sleep. But they left him to die like a tramp on the street. When the battles are over and the victory's won, everyone mourns for the poor man's son. Red, white, and blue, and victory sweet, and they leave him to die like a tramp on the street. He was somebody's darling. He was some other's son. Once he was there. Once he was young. Some mother, she rocked him, her little darling, to sleep, and they left him to die like a tramp on the street. Jesus, who died on Calvary's tree, shed his lifeblood for you and for me. They pierced his side, his hands and his feet, and they left him to die like a tramp on the street. He was Mary's own darling. He was God's chosen son. Once he was fair, once he was young. Mary, she rocked him, her little darling, to sleep. But they left him to die like a tramp on the street. Yes, they left him to die like a tramp on the street.
Well, this was what the video was. As you saw, it started out from a Life magazine's thing of the American fighter pilot thanking the Dow Chemical Company for making better napalm, because the first napalm they made, this is from Life magazine, the first napalm they made was lousy because the people could jump in the water and get away from the burning. But the second napalm they made was really good stuff. White phosphorus, really beta. Because then, even if they jumped in the water, it would keep burning through right to the bone, and they'd die. And he's thanking, he calls them the boys in the back room at Dow who came up with this. That's what we were in front of on November 18th, 1965. This is just a little piece of it. The clash on that day was between holiness and wickedness. The wicked is always trying to come in to human life under the auspices of the holy, because then it can't be questioned. And so, on that, and what this leads to is this. In a strange kind of way, if you look at this, if you look for this video now, this was made for Memorial Day at one time, but it's up on the YouTube as Mother, or in the Vimeo and other things as Mother of Sorrows on my website. Because what those women in Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, wherever it was, were experiencing as their babies and their children were being torn apart and dead and in front of them and heads blown off and so forth and so on, was exactly what the Blessed Mother was experiencing at Calvary with the dead body of Jesus in her arms. That image of Mary with the dead body of Jesus in her arms, which is famous because of Michelangelo's Pieta, but that goes way back before Michelangelo. His Pieta was just a piece of genius. That image, Mother of Sorrows, is an ancient image of Mary. It's an iconography, it's on and on. Because it's obvious. It's obvious. The Catholic Church, as a matter of fact, in some of its liturgies says, and dangerously so because it could be misinterpreted, there were two altars on Calvary. There was Christ's altar on the cross, and there was Mary's altar that she suffered and sacrificed on at the foot of the cross. But the understanding is the horror of your own child being in your arms, mutilated, tormented, killed, whatever the case may be, as Jesus was, as all those children in the movie would be for 9 minutes. They were left to die by the American government as tramps in the street. Now, I made reference to the Holy Cross order, the Holy Cross priests here at Notre Dame, not the order, because I'm only talking about the ones who are here and here then. No, I'm talking about the ones that are here now too. Because of all the orders in the Catholic Church, all of them, there is only one order that has officially as its patron Mary, the Mother of Sorrows, and that's the Congregation of Holy Cross. There is a place for the gold dome. Mary in the glory of God. That's marvelous. Wouldn't change that for anything. But by sending the ROTC out, by embracing CIA, by embracing Tao, they're doing the same thing that the military in Rome did to Jesus, the University of Notre Dame. They're agents for sticking the spear in the heart because the political boss told them so, and killing the son and the mother weeping over the death. Earlier this year, I believe, there was a ceremony at Notre Dame for those who had gone to Vietnam as military people and veterans and so forth and so on. Rocky Bleier was here and so forth. Where was the ceremony for those that they killed over there? Is this a Catholic church at Notre Dame, or is this a national church? National Catholicism. Those people that died in Vietnam, many of whom were Catholic, because Vietnam, the French, were their lives nothing? Were there any prayers for them? Are there any prayers ever said on this campus for the people that the graduates of Notre Dame and the military have killed over all the time Notre Dame has been training people on this campus to kill people? And that goes back to at least the First World War. Why? Are those lives of the people that were killed, do they mean nothing? Why not? Is that loving the enemy? I remember it used to be a practice of the Irish Republican Army in Ireland during the teens, when that hard fighting was going on. That when the Irish Catholic men assassinated someone, one of the Protestant leaders or whatever it was, it was a practice. Before he shot him, just before he shot him, it got in the head of where he was aiming, he'd say, "God have mercy on your soul," and shoot him. All wrong, but the understanding was there that this person was a human being with an immortal soul, and that, fine, I did this here, but I'm still recognizing what he is, and recognizing, asking God to have mercy on him. Where is that goes on here? These guys go out of here. Kids, they're kids. These kids go out of here with second lieutenant or that, whatever. They're trained to kill. They go over there. And they've been doing it decade in and decade out. And I have yet, since 1958, since I've been here around here, I have yet to hear a prayer for any person that was killed by a Notre Dame graduate who went through ROTC or in the military. That's not Catholicism. That's nationalism, blind nationalism. That's not living out of your charism of mother of sorrows. Do you just have sorrow for your own ethnic group, your own nationals that suffer? Do you just honor the widows of people that whose sons, or the mothers whose sons have been killed, who happen to fall under a certain geography of longitude and latitude or a flag? That's not Catholicism. That's a breach of Catholicism. When I was growing up, not only my mother, but just about every mother I knew, there used to be a lot of people after the war, even during the war, Second World War now, who were, what would you say, were understood to be derelicts. Life was hard. Life was hard for a lot of people. And I remember as a little kid, my mother always said, every time she passed one of those people, always dropped a dime or something in the can, or if they were just there, she always said, and a lot of Irish mothers said, "Oh, God help him, he's someone's son. He's someone's son." If we had seen this tonight, we would see that the men and women of the children who were killed by the United States military, whether it be in Fallujah or in Saigon, that they were the children of some mother's son in the agony of the mother and father. But that's all forgotten. That's all passed over. For what? For our heroes. A propaganda term to ignore the fact that you have killed a human being unjustly. Because Trump or Obama or Clinton or Reagan or Kennedy say you can kill a human being, that's not a carte blanche for Catholics to go out and kill. Catholic just war theory is not the presumption in Catholic moral theology. The presumption is Catholic moral theology is peace. The conflict is to be settled peacefully. Why is it the presumption? Because that's what's in the gospel. Nonviolence is the presumption of Catholic moral theology. Catholic just war theory is the exception that can only be met if you follow every single one of the standards and, as the Catechism says, follow them strictly. That is not being done with the people who came out of Notre Dame as ROTC graduates at any time that I know of in recent past, including the First World War. and I defy anyone to show me differently. And so, we have this situation. The situation is that there are no tears. There are no tears at Notre Dame for the sons and daughters of people who were liquidated by graduates from Notre Dame. Worse, to go back to the beginning, there's a placing of an aura of holiness over it. You are doing God's will. For the Catholic, God's will is the will of God as revealed by Jesus, because Jesus is God. You want to tell me Jesus isn't God? I'll say fine, then don't follow him. But once the incarnation steps in, then Jesus, not the Pope, speaks infallibly first. That is an infallible teaching. A fellow here, Jean Mayer, a biblical scholar here at Notre Dame, wonderful scholar, major. He's written a series of books called The Marginal Jew, Jesus. But be that, in volume 4, he talks about the fact that no one in the history of the world ever said the sentence, love your enemies, before Jesus. They've said something close to it, but love your enemies is an original sentence with Jesus Christ, and he's positive that's the case. He spends about 20 pages laying it out. What we know is it's an authentic teaching of Jesus. ROTC prepares people not to love their enemies, but to kill their enemies. Dow, CIA, that's what they're about. Not loving your enemies, meaning it's Christ loved their enemies. Now, there's no tears at Notre Dame for the people who were murdered by the people that they embraced and therefore gave religious credence to. No tears, no thought. It's just gone. And that was so evident that what was happening back on November 18, 1969, was we were now giving full public embrace to the heinous, Dow and CIA. The heinous that the world knew was heinous, the whole country knew was heinous. And we were now giving the mantle of Notre Dame to this, meaning the mantle of the holiness as to the Catholic Church. So I would ask any Holy Cross priest, if your charism is tied officially to Mary, the Mother of Sorrows, what are you going out causing sorrow for mothers for? I'd like to hear the answer, because we know that's what's happening. Going 7,000 miles east-west to do it. And so I'll conclude with this. Tonight we said Mass over at Holy Cross Chapel, across the street here. Beautiful chapel. I've never been in it. Just magnificent, magnificent. I mean, it's the kind of place I'd like to sit and pray, you know? It's one of those things, good things that Notre Dame does, really good. I often thought that the best thing about Notre Dame when I was here was the fact that I was able to go to Mass every day. There were so many Masses on campus. The Eucharist, I mean, this was being filled with the medicine of immortality, the body of Christ, life itself, every single day. Easily just go to Sacred Heart Church, 11:30 or 5 or dawn or something. Well, anyway, we said Mass over here tonight. We had Mass over here. We celebrate the liturgy together. And we prayed for what we prayed for. 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 Holy Cross Chapel is called, meaning Holy Cross Auto Chapel, and that's how it, then of course, Holy Cross, the Holy Cross. Any thought of the Holy Cross is not Jesus suffering mere animal pain. The salvation of the cross is not through the animal pain that Jesus suffers. It's by the fact that he loves his enemies through the suffering. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's the spiritual part of the cross. Mere animal pain does not save. That's not what the New Testament says. So we celebrate the Mass over there today. I don't know if anyone else noticed it, but right behind the altar, there is a beautiful, beautiful stained glass window of Mary. Beautiful. She's dark-skinned. Beautiful. In the Holy Cross Chapel, Holy Cross Center, underneath it, it says, Our Lady, Mother of Sorrows. This whole situation of militarism, Catholicism, Christianity, the gospel, Jesus and his way is just such a conglomeration here that you can't untie it. But what is happening is people are being trained here to kill other human beings. And they're being trained with the university, that is, with the validation by the university that this is a way to follow Jesus. To that extent, the university is lying to them, not telling them the truth. And so I would conclude with this. A few years ago, 2011, I think it was, a group of us met, a group called PeaceNet, that was founded by a man who was graduated from Notre Dame as a conscientious objector in 1944. Frank Carver. And we had been thinking about this conscientious objector thing as a group because so many people applied to be part of the group. And we found all kinds of people who were conscientious objectors in the Vietnam War no one ever heard of. They were there, though. They were, all right. And many of them suffered greatly because of it. Well, anyway, we decided that maybe a good petition to make to the university, especially where they have this gargantuan monument to the war heroes and people that killed over where the field house used to be. Veterans Memorial, or whatever they want to call it. Maybe there could be a little memorial someplace to people who lived the other Catholic tradition, and it is Catholic. People who lived as conscientious objectors to war and gave their service to the country and to the church by trying to follow the nonviolent Jesus of the gospel and his way. So we decided on that, and a representative went from us, and we decided the best place to start was with Ted Hesburgh, who was emeritus at that time. He wasn't still president, but just because he was who he was, and he had a lot of clout. It was a nice way to start things off, you know? And he could make things happen with a wink and a handshake that if you went through bureaucracies, you know, you couldn't do it. Okay, so our representative went to Ted and told him what the proposal was, that we have some kind of monument, memorial. It didn't have to be ostentatious. It didn't have, wherever on the campus, that would just remember those Notre Dame graduates who were conscientious objectors. And his answer was immediate and total. I will not support such a project. Now, mind you, Ted Hesburgh did a lot to support people individually who were conscientious objectors. But when it came to using the university to support a simple monument, simple memorial, That was a different story. That was a different story. I will not support such a project. And so, people come here, and there's that megalith over there of a memorial to veterans, you know. There's nothing, absolutely nothing. People don't even know there were conscience objectors from Notre Dame. And we just scratched the surface with the few tools we had. Well, they were there. I was one of them. Mark was another, and others. But the point is that even the mayor of South Bend at one time graduated from Notre Dame. It's a conscientious objector. No one knew that. Nothing. Nothing. And so maybe a good step would be just for the university to recognize in some very, very serious way, but not ostentatious necessarily, some monument, some memorial that would recognize those who serve their countries, those who serve God, and those who serve Notre Dame, not by going to war and killing, but by following the nonviolent Jesus of the gospel. And if anyone says that you are not serving your country, serving God, or serving Notre Dame by following Jesus, I'd like to hear them say it out loud. That's the maximum way you can serve. There's other things that can be done. An annual mass that prays for the victims of those people who went to war from Notre Dame and killed. An annual mass, just the Catholicity of it all. That these are not just things, these are human beings with immortal souls. And finally, Notre Dame, to say Notre Dame this, Notre Dame did that, Notre Dame didn't do this, Notre Dame did do that, is dangerous. Because Notre Dame does nothing. Notre Dame is a concept based on a set of human arrangements. Notre Dame makes no decision. It has no center of personality from which to make a moral decision. The moral decisions are made by the president, the vice president, the administration, whatever they are. The moral decisions are made by human beings, not by a concept. People hide behind concepts. But the moral decision on the Dow CIA thing was made by Ted Hesburgh. The moral decision to keep training military people to kill on a Catholic campus is made by human beings in the administration. And so forth. Notre Dame doesn't make those decisions. Human beings make those decisions. Notre Dame is the cover. And therefore, you all know the motto of the Jesuits, AMDG, A Majorem Gloriam Dei, for the greater honor and glory of God. Any Jesuit university you go to, any place you go, you know. There it is, Jesuits are AMDG, and so forth and so on. For the greater honor and glory of God. That's not the motto. They've cut it. They've shortened it. They don't put the whole motto up there. The motto comes from St. Ignatius directly. The motto for the Jesuits for hundreds of years that was given by St. Ignatius is, for the greater glory of God and the salvation of souls. In the Catholic Church, the primary law of the Catholic Church is the salvation of souls. That's lost. Unless you're going to say, that embracing Dow CIA is a way to save souls. The Mass, wonderful. The confessions, all that is right and holy. The novenas, the grotto, all that is absolutely consistent with the salvation of souls individually and in all humanity. But what is going on November 18, 1969, with the embrace of Dow and CIA, with the sending over of group after group to kill people 7,000 miles away? That's not being concerned about the salvation of souls. And so, my final suggestion is, and I mean it, it would behoove the Holy Cross Order attached to Notre Dame, the priests and the brothers, before they begin each school year, to go up to Land O'Lakes or wherever the place is they go, and to make a retreat on how their charism, how their patron, the Lady, the Mother of Sorrows, is to govern their lives as Holy Cross priest here at Notre Dame. There's a lot of ways it does, but there's some ways that it doesn't, and it may want to work at that. So, the window on the Holy Cross Chapel says it all. Our Lady, Mother of Sorrows, dark-skinned, because most of the babies, most of the killing of children, and we're talking millions upon millions, were dark-skinned sons or daughters of mothers who were dark-skinned, as was Jesus. And we know that Jesus, and we don't talk about that, Jesus was killed by the obedient military, Roman state military, was the cause of the first Pieta. But we don't talk about that. We almost talk about Jesus suffering as if he suffered dying of cancer in bed. That's not what the gospel teaches. He died, he was murdered at the hands of the state military with the support of the religious elite of his time and place. So, what are we supposed to do now? Go home and go to sleep. We've already put Carl to sleep.
Okay, well, it is 9:45 now, so
Feel free.
should we take some time for questions, or? Okay, does anyone have any questions?
Not a question in a group.
Okay, well, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.